My life in the suburbs was picture perfect to anyone looking in. A big house with a sprawling backyard, a pristine pool that sparkled under the sun, a hardworking husband, and a 20-year-old son about to graduate college. But behind those closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. My husband, Mark, spent most of his time at work, and when he was home, he was glued to his phone or TV. The warmth we once shared had turned cold over the years, leaving me feeling invisible in my own marriage. It was a Saturday afternoon in early summer when I first noticed Dennis. He was my son Eric's best friend, a polite, confident young man who had been coming over to hang out for months. I never really paid him much attention before, but that day something shifted. Eric had invited Dennis to swim in our backyard pool from the kitchen. I caught a glimpse of them through the sliding glass door. Dennis stood on the pool's edge, his body glistening with water under the midday sun. His athletic frame was lean yet muscular, his dark skin flawless, and smooth he dove effortlessly into the water, resurfacing with a grin that showcased perfect white teeth. For a moment, I couldn't look away. It wasn't just his looks that caught my attention, it was his confidence. The way he carried himself, so different from my husband's distant and tired demeanor. I felt a strange stirring inside me, one that I hadn't felt in years. I brushed off the feeling and turned my focus back to the dishes, but my mind kept wandering back to him. Over the next few weeks, Dennis began spending more time at our house. He and Eric worked out together in our garage, played video games late into the night, and sometimes just lounged by the pool. Each time Dennis was around, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence one afternoon while Eric ran to the store. Dennis came inside for a drink. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Mrs. Blake, do you mind if I grab some water?" Dennis asked, his deep voice startling me. "Of course, Dennis," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. And when I sat down on the already couch, "Please call me Amanda," he flashed that charming smile again. "Thanks, Amanda," as he reached for a glass. Our hands accidentally brushed. It was a small, fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through me. I quickly pulled my hand back, hoping he hadn't noticed the way my breath hitched. "Sorry about that," he said with a chuckle. "It's fine." I murmured, my cheeks flushing after he left the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head. What was happening to me? I was a married woman in her 40s. Yet here I was, blushing like a teenager over a boy half my age. Later that evening, I sat by the pool after everyone had gone to bed. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its gentle ripples mirroring the unrest in my heart. I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something about Dennis that drew me in, something I couldn't explain or control. I told myself it was just a harmless crush, something that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew better. The way he looked at me earlier that day, it wasn't just in my head. There was something unspoken between us, a spark that couldn't be ignored. As the night wore on, I resolved to push these feelings aside. I was a wife, a mother, and I had a family to protect. But even as I made that promise to myself, I couldn't help but wonder, what if? Stay tuned to find out how one moment of weakness can unravel a life. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping, dramatic stories that dive into the deepest corners of the human heart. I tried to ignore the feelings, to bury them under the routine of my daily life, but Dennis made it impossible. His presence filled every corner of my home, his laughter echoing through the walls, his scent lingering in the air long after he'd left a room. It was a week after that night by the pool when things took a turn. Eric and Dennis were playing basketball in our driveway, their shirts tossed aside in the summer heat. I had opened the living room window to let in some air, and Eric ground his way into the garage. Their playful banter floated inside. I tried to focus on folding laundry, but my eyes kept drifting to Dennis. When they finished playing, Eric ran inside to grab something from his room, leaving Dennis on the porch with a bottle of water. He caught me watching through the window and smiled. It wasn't just a friendly smile, it was knowing, like he could see right through me. My heart raced, and I quickly looked away, pretending to busy myself with the laundry. "Nice day, isn't it?" Dennis's voice startled me. He was standing just outside the window now, leaning casually against the frame. Yes, it is, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. You should come outside more. Mrs. Blake gets some sun, he said, his tone light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I'm fine right here, but thank you, I said, forcing a smile before turning away. But his words lingered. It wasn't just the suggestion, it was the way he said it, like he was challenging me. Later that evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Dennis walked in, his footsteps soft on the tile. Need any help? He asked, his voice low. And no, I've got it, I replied, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me. You work too hard, you know that. I paused the plate in my hand, forgotten. No one had said anything like that to me in years. It's just what I do, I said with a small shrug. Well, maybe someone should take care of you for a change, he said, his eyes locking with mine. My breath caught. There it was again, that spark, that unspoken tension between us. I was frozen, caught in his gaze, like a moth to a flame. Before I could respond, Eric came into the room, breaking the moment. Dennis straightened up, his easy smile returning. Thanks for dinner, Mrs. Blake, he said, before walking out with Eric. But his words hung in the air, heavier than I wanted to admit. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and fleeting touches. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. Another time, while walking past him in the hallway, his arm grazed mine, sending a shiver down my spine. I knew this was dangerous. I was walking a fine line. One wrong step could destroy everything. But the more I tried to resist, the more I found myself drawn to him. One afternoon, while Eric was out running errands, Dennis stayed behind. I was sitting on the patio, sipping iced tea when he joined me. Mind if I sit? He asked. Of course not, I replied, trying to sound casual. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sounds the chirping of birds, the distant hum traffic. Then he turned to me. You seem different lately. Everything okay? I hesitated, unsure how to respond, just a lot on my mind. I said finally, if there's anything I can do. I was trailed off, but the implication was clear. I looked at him, really looked at him, and in that moment I felt something shift. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a longing and need to feel alive again. Sometimes one decision can change everything. Will Amanda give in to her desires, or will she step back from the edge and subscribe to follow this gripping tale of passion and betrayal? The moment I gave in was inevitable. Though I had spent weeks convincing myself otherwise, it was a humid Friday evening, and Mark and Eric had gone to a baseball game in the city. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts wander into dangerous territory. Dennis stayed behind that night, saying he wasn't a fan of baseball. I didn't question it. Part of me was relieved he stayed, part of me was terrified. I was sitting on the couch with a book, though I couldn't focus on a single page. Dennis appeared in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim hallway light. Mind if I join you? He asked, holding up a glass of water. Of course, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat beside me, closer than he ever had before. The air between us felt electric, charged with the tension we had been doing around for weeks. You seem nervous, he said, after a moment, his voice soft. I'm fine. I lied, though. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page of my book. He reached out and gently took the book from my hands, placing it on the coffee table. Amanda, you don't have to pretend with me. Hearing him say my name like that, without the formalities, without the pretense, sent a shiver through me. I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. I can't, I started, but the words caught in my throat. You can, he said, his voice steady and sure. I know you feel it too. And in that moment, I stopped thinking. I stopped worrying about right or wrong, about the consequences that would come crashing down. I leaned in, and he met me halfway when our lips touched. It was like the floodgates opened. Weeks of suppressed desire came rushing out, consuming us both. His hands were strong yet gentle as they cued my face, pulling me closer. I melted into him, forgetting everything except the way he made me feel. Guilt, we moved from the couch to the bedroom where I had spent so many lonely nights, wondering if my husband even noticed me anymore. Now someone did. But as the night wore on, reality began to creep back in. I lay beside Dennis, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What had I done? This can't happen again, I said quietly, though I didn't believe the words, even as I spoke them. I don't think you mean that, Dennis replied, his voice calm and confident. I turned to face him, searching for some hint of doubt or hesitation in his expression. There was none. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You deserve to feel this way, Amanda. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His words were a balm to my wounded heart, but it couldn't erase the guilt that had already taken root over the next few weeks. Our secret affair continued. We stole moments whenever we could when Eric was out. When Mark was working late, the thrill of sneaking around only heightened the intensity. But it also made me paranoid. One afternoon, as we sat together on the patio, Dennis reached for my hand. I pulled away quickly, glancing nervously toward the house. Relax, he said with a smirk. No one's home. That's not the point. I whispered, my eyes darting to the windows, but it wasn't just the fear of being caught that gnawed at me every time we were together. I felt myself slipping further away from the person I used to be. The first crack in our secret came one evening when Mark found Dennis's hoodie draped over the back of a dining chair. Did Dennis leave us here? He asked casually. Yes, I said quickly, my heart pounding. He must have forgotten it after dinner. Mark raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Still, the encounter left me shaken. How long before he started asking more questions? The answer came sooner than I expected. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and the house was full of the usual noise. Eric and Dennis laughing in the backyard, Mark flipping channels in the living room, and me pretending everything was fine as I set the table for dinner, but everything wasn't fine. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of my secret was beginning to crush me. Every time I looked at Mark, guilt twisted in my stomach like a knife. Every time I saw Eric, I felt like the worst mother in the world. Dennis caught my eye through the kitchen window, giving me a small, knowing smile. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away. I had to end this. I had to stop before it all came crashing down. But fate had other plans. It happened that evening. Mark had stepped outside to take a phone call, and Eric was upstairs showering after their swim. Marcus and I were alone in the kitchen, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. I can't do this anymore, I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. You don't mean that. I do, I insisted. Though my resolve wavered as he looked at me. This is wrong, Dennis. It has to stop. Before he could respond, the back door opened, and Mark walked in for a moment. I thought we'd managed to compose ourselves, but then his eyes narrowed, flicking between Dennis and me. What's going on here? He asked, his tone sharp. Nothing, I said quickly, my voice too high-pitched to be convincing. Mark's gaze lingered on me, then shifted to Dennis. Eric's friend or not, you better explain yourself, kid. Dennis hesitated, but before he could speak, Eric appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from the shower. What's going on? He asked, looking between us. The suppressive, then, to my horror, Mark turned to Eric. How well do you really know your friend, son, Dad? What are you talking about? Eric asked, frowning. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of suspicion and betrayal. Amanda, is there something you want to tell me? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, but I couldn't bring myself to say. It was Dennis who finally broke the silence, Mr. Blake. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Don't lie to me, Mark roared, slamming his hand down on the counter. The room erupted into chaos. Eric demanded answers. Dennis tried to explain, and Mark turned his fury on me. By the time the dust settled, the truth was out. Eric stormed out of the house, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. Dennis left shortly after, his usual confidence replaced by a look of shame. Mark and I were left alone in the kitchen, the silence between us deafening. How long? He asked finally, his voice hollow. I couldn't meet his eyes. A few weeks, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. A few weeks with our son's best friend? God, Amanda, what were you thinking? I wasn't, I said, tears streaming down my face. I was lonely, Mark. You've been so distant, and don't you dare blame this on me, he snapped. You made this choice, not me. He stormed out, leaving me alone with my guilt and regret. The aftermath was a nightmare. Eric refused to speak to me, and Mark moved into the guest room. The house felt like a war zone, every interaction charged with anger and hurt. Marcus stopped coming around, and I couldn't blame him. His friendship with Eric was over, and any chance of repairing my family seemed impossible. I spent my days trying to piece my life back together, but the damage was done. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Months later, I'm still living with the consequences of my actions. Mark and I are in therapy, though it's unclear if our marriage will survive. Eric has started to forgive me, but our relationship will never be the same as for Dennis. He's moved on. I saw him once at a coffee shop, and we exchanged a brief, awkward glance before he turned and walked away. I've learned a hard lesson. A moment of weakness can destroy a lifetime of trust. Life is full of choices, and some can change everything in an instant. If you want more gripping emotional stories like this one, be sure to like and subscribe. There's always another tale waiting to be told.